Welcome, my darlings. Make yourself comfortable, and I have a tale to tell you. If you enjoy it, please be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and leave me a comment. I always enjoy your comments. Now, let us begin. Sarcophagus by Scare in a Box. Consciousness returned slowly, the drugs leaving Lorcan's system, to find he was moving slowly down. The walls around him, made of metal, an elevator. He breathed in deeply. There were those who spoke of it, the sarcophagus, but no one knew the truth. It seemed as though anyone who walked in never returned. None were missing. He wouldn't be either. The choices he made no longer making him seem human to most others. The end of his life, something they wouldn't be saddened by. Not even his mother would cry. Lorcan stared at the door. Escaping the elevator was an impossibility. But there may be other chances. Whatever the others said might be nothing more than stories to spread fear into those who were chosen, the way he had been. It was his time to be useful. At least that was what they said. So it was likely he'd be given some kind of job to do. Finally, his consciousness, fully his once more, the elevator reached the right stop, and the doors opened automatically. Outside were guards. Each held a firearm pointed directly at Lorcan. Something he'd become used to. Stepping out, knowing it was what he was supposed to do, he looked at each of them in turn before the sound of footsteps started to come from in front of him. At the same time, the elevator started to move back up. Glancing back, no sign of an easy route to follow the elevator. Lorcan waited, the footsteps likely belonging to the person who explained it all to him. When they stepped into the light, a young woman who looked as though she was barely out of college. He raised an eyebrow. She didn't seem to pay any attention to his reaction. "Lorcan O'Connell?" Who else was it going to be? Nodding, not wanting to anger her on the first day he studied her. "You have been brought to the sarcophagus to assist us in our research." She gestured for him to follow her, as though he had any other choice. The guards gently urged him in that direction. "This facility is somewhere you will not be able to escape. Your escapades are well known to us, Mr. O'Connell." Saying nothing, certain he wasn't meant to, Lorcan kept his eyes on where they were going. The guards were watching him closely, but if he was there to assist with some kind of research, it was likely he'd be dealing with scientists. All it took was for one of them to make a mistake. "You, of course, don't believe me, but you may when I explain more about the work you'll be doing." She glanced back. "There have been those who thought they might be able to use me as their route out. It didn't work out for them, and it won't work out for you either." There was a certainty in her voice Lorcan had never heard before. "Whatever you may imagine, I was chosen for a reason. Yes, I am young. However, my father has been working on learning more for many years now. He's no longer able to deal with the depth. We are deep under the sea." He stared at her back. "This is the deepest I believe any humans have ever been. During one of my father's journeys down here, he found something. Sadly, due to a lack of understanding of what it was, both his companions died, and it was then he started to understand there was so much more to it than he could have imagined. Now, after many years of studying, we understand better. At some point in our distant past, someone or something built something down here. Father believes it may be some kind of temple connected to an old god. But so far, the only thing we are certain of is that we haven't yet explored everything. It's below us, deeper than we are, And you're our next new explorer. You'll be going into the ruins. There will be no lights. One of the strangest things about the ruins is the light source of any kind are useless. In the early days, we tried them all, attempting to find a solution to the problem. Back when Father first found it, they used ropes, believing it would be enough, and finding it wasn't the case. Before you're sent in, you'll be given a suit, which uses sound waves in order for you to navigate, similar to a bat. We know these work, although so far we haven't had anyone return to us. We simply have an extended map with another disappearance added to the list. You may be an exception to the rule, Mr. O'Connell. That seemed unlikely. Was he permitted to ask questions? Lorcan ranked a hand through his hair. Eyes were still on the back of the woman leading him through the facility, someone who had never given him a name. What did it matter when it was obvious he was going to be lost within the ruins like all the others? How many had there been through the years, so it got to the point where everyone knew about it? So far you've been very quiet. It's not unusual. Finding out where you are often has an effect on people. But I'm willing to answer any questions you may have at this point, if I have an answer to give you. Does anything actually matter? Lorcan shook his head when she glanced back at him, her eyes emotionless. You can answer my questions, but I'm going to walk into the ruins alone, knowing I'm never going to return. Anything you'd like to tell me right now means nothing. Maybe it does. Some have been fascinated by the very idea of the ruin, believing they will be the one to find their way out. You, on the other hand, have gone in the opposite direction, not willing to think if it's possible for you might be an exception, and therefore all of this means nothing to you. I have found this have an effect on how much deeper you can get. Those who have seen themselves being different have been lost to us far sooner. Have you never been scared one of us might come back out? Why scared? Mr. O'Connell, if one of you does end up becoming the exception to the rule, it will change everything for us. She stopped, turning to look at me, her eyes on mine. I have no doubt what you think of us and the decisions we've made in order to map these ruins. Had they been anywhere else, I'm certain the government would have closed them up a long time ago. Instead, they keep sending you to us in order to understand more. Understanding is more important than I think you could possibly understand. How were they made? Does this mean they were civilizations who were able to get down this deep in order to build their temples? We know so little, and the very thought of one of you returning is something we haven't dared to have, as there have been hundreds lost. Too many. At times I've argued against this, saying it would be best to stop, yet there are those who argue we can't. Not until we know what's in there. If something dangerous, then we need to find a way to stop it. Although I have no reason to think it's something we could do easily. More than anything, I want someone to be the exception, to find their way back, to tell us what they found. But every time it doesn't happen, my belief it can dies a little bit more. One day I have to believe something will change and the person we sent into the ruins will come back. If I didn't, I'd not be able to do my job. Something I have to admit I sometimes wish wasn't mine at all. But I am the only person who followed in Father's footsteps. He's unwilling to give up the same way the government is, leading to us being disposable. We made bad choices in our lives, so it doesn't matter if we don't return. If it was someone else, everything would be different. Yes, it would be. And I don't see you as disposable, Mr. O'Connell. I want you to return. She stepped over to a locker, taking out a suit that looked like it might have been based on those divers wore. Please remove your clothing and put on the suit. Ready to make your journey into the ruins." Blinking, Lorcan took it. "You want me to strip right here?" "It's nothing we haven't all seen before." Shrugging, certain it didn't matter, he stripped off his prison wear, slowly shimmying into the suit. As he did, she was focused on a screen instead of him, while the guards all had their firearms still pointed at him. There was no way of knowing what he might do, although it wasn't like he'd try taking on multiple guards at the same time. When he did have a chance of finding a way out of there, maybe that was why no one returned. Pulling the hood over his head, a small headphone slipped into his ear. "Let me know if you can hear the voice of the computer." She tapped a couple of points on the screen. "Should be coming over to you in a second." "Good afternoon, Mr. O'Connell." "I can hear it." Nodding, she looked at him one last time. "This is where you start. Please continue to follow the path. You'll find a point where the lights stop. When that happens, you've reached the ruins." Breathing in deeply, Lorcan took a moment to work through his emotions, preparing for what leaving probably meant. They didn't push him to move, seeming to understand the situation. Instead, they gave him that time. Maybe she did actually want one of them to return. She saw him as their chance for it to happen. It was impossible to know for certain. Starting down the path in silence, Lorcan didn't look back at any point. All he'd seen were those guards still pointing their firearms at him, ready to shoot at any point it should be necessary. And it wasn't. He was willing to do what they wanted him to do, however illogical it was for them to keep sending people down into a ruin that they probably knew killed anyone who entered it. Reaching the darkness took a few minutes, enough time to put up a lot of distance between them and anything that did come out. Because if there wasn't something in there, why was no one ever finding their way back? Or to somewhere else entirely? Maybe there were, and somewhere within was some kind of teleporter that would take him somewhere else entirely. Lorcan laughed at himself. Granddad was the one who read him stories about other worlds, up until he wasn't there anymore. His death hitting hard. The memories were still painful. He sighed, pushing them back, the way he always did. Mom was the one who tried to use that as the explanation for how he got himself into the position he was. And maybe it did have something to do with it. If it hadn't been so sudden, one moment here and the next gone, it might have been easier. Only death was never easy. Understanding that pain should have been the reason he never forced it on to use someone else. Instead, Lorcan found himself in a dark place, wanting everyone to hurt the way he did. Some said everything would have been different had he been in therapy, been able to talk to someone, working through those emotions. They were probably wrong, even though it was rare. Lorcan thought it was much more likely that there was something wrong inside him. If there wasn't, he might have cared when he killed those people. Granddad was the one person he truly cared about, and losing him, well, it was an inevitability. All mortals die. Even he would, potentially in the ruins he had almost reached. It was probably for the best he was there. At least his death would mean something to those who wanted to understand what was there. Reaching the point where all lights stopped, Lorcan gave himself another moment, knowing when he stepped into the darkness, everything was going to be different. Finally, after longer than he should have waited, he stepped into the darkness, losing all sight in the second it took. Touching the wall with one hand, Lorcan at least knew he was somewhere. It wasn't all a hoax. He breathed in deeply, slowly, running his hand over the cold stone. "Walk forward, Mr. O'Connell, until I tell you to turn." Doing as he was told, the easiest task, Lorcan thought of the woman who'd sent him down here. How similar her voice was to that of the computer. Maybe they'd used her to create it because she made the decision to take over from her father. To those who started wandering the ruins would at least have some consistency. Left here, knowing he should do what he was told straight away, Lorcan still reached out with his one hand to see if there was a wall on the right. There was. Interesting. Going left, the silence lasted longer than it had before. He found himself wondering how large the ruin was. He didn't have any idea of what it looked like. Maybe he should have asked more questions, ignoring the fact that he was walking into something he knew nothing about was stupid. Right now. Once again, Lorcan reached out for the other wall, realizing there was nothing there. As he turned, his arm brushed against a wall in front of him, so he'd been moments away from walking directly into the wall. Something he definitely would have done had he not reacted differently to the voice. "Could you give me a little more warning?" It wasn't going to be able to hear him, probably programmed to not say anything more than it did. "Unless you want me to break my nose on a wall." There was no response. Exactly what he expected. Lorcan kept walking, not feeling anywhere near close to tired, which might have something to do with the suit. Hopefully there was also something within it that would stop him from becoming hungry or thirsty. Otherwise, there was going to be issues in the future. Sighing, Lorcan knew there was nothing else he could do other than to think and wait for the suit to tell him where to go again. Thinking meant going over everything he'd done before. A nightly ritual for him most of the time, as he tried to work out whether his life could have ended differently, or if he was always going to be the kind of person who ended up wandering in the darkness as a disposable explorer, chosen by the government to do something they wouldn't let anyone else do. Another right. More prepared than before, Lorcan checked all the walls around him. They were all open, but he needed to go right, however tempting it was to go against the computer. It might be the way he was able to find a route out of the ruins, although if he did, he was going to be able to find his way back to the surface. Being deeper than the sea made it that much more complicated, and it was probably the main reason they weren't worried about someone being able to escape, if there was a way out. Glancing left, even though he still couldn't see anything, he turned right. Had someone else gone the same way as him in the past? So he was simply following their route, and eventually the time would come where Lorcan would step down a path no one had ever been before. Not that he would know when it was. The computer might have that knowledge, without being able to share it with him. Walking for what felt like longer than before, Lorcan closed his eyes. It wasn't as though it mattered whether they were open or closed. The darkness, unlike anything he'd seen before. In some ways, it was easier to be looking at the soft darkness of his own eyelids, rather than the hard darkness of the ruins around him. How was it even possible? There was no darkness quite as dark anywhere else, at least not that Lorcan knew of, and it was one of those things he'd learned about from Granddad. Was it simply his vision? At least when his eyes were open? Closed, they couldn't see anything at all. Granddad would have been fascinated by the ruins. He was the kind of person who would have thrown as many people as necessary at the problem in order to learn as much as possible. Now, Lorcan was one of the people helping with that, finding answers to a question that was beyond all human understanding. At least right then. Granddad would have wanted him to volunteer for it, and maybe he had, by following the path that had found himself on, learning more about a different kind of darkness. A darkness someone could have within their soul. Raking a hand through his hair, Lorcan kept moving, feeling his hair reminding him he still existed. He was still a person walking through a dark ruin, only able to know where he was going thanks to the computer within his suit. Someone might have been able to find their way through a certain distance without help. But why would they try? Obviously someone had. The first person to find the ruins, walking into a darkness they definitely couldn't have understood. Because they were explorers, and that's what they did. No one sane would have made a choice to delve deeper into the depths the way they had. How was it even possible? Another question he should have asked before. Left. Going left, not checking the walls, Lorcan kept walking. What did it matter? He didn't need to know anything. Someone else was going to learn everything he found out because they'd chosen him as their next explorer. It wasn't something that he had ever chosen for himself. But then his choices hadn't exactly been good ones. Do you remember killing him? The voice was still the same, but thoughtful. Killing who? Your list is long. Why did you do it? How long is a piece of string? Lorcan shrugged. Pain is sometimes stronger than we are. We are? Humans. Mortals. He breathed in deep, half wishing there was someone to look at. Who are you? Now, that's an interesting question. But you already know the answer. All you need do is look deep inside yourself. Who are you? Do you remember dying? Switching from female, the voice belonged to the woman upstairs, to male. It seemed as though Lorcan was talking to himself, another of the many things he wasn't able to understand. How could the voice change if everything was programmed to work the way it did? Was it something they were doing to him? Attempting to turn, to go back, Lorcan found himself trapped in place. Closing his eyes once more, he thought of the questions the voice asked. He asked, who was he? Did he remember dying? How could he remember dying when he was alive? Deeper than before, memories swirled around him. Lorcan saw himself as he was, long before he found himself in prison. The man below him was one of the men he'd killed, becoming a serial killer. Wanted to find a way to free himself. Only the man didn't look the way he had before. He looked like Lorcan. Lorcan killed Lorcan. It was the same for every memory. He saw things as they were, as they'd been, and how they were going to be. Within the prison there were hundreds of Lorcans. Some were the prisoners, all of them arrested for one crime or another, placed together to pay for their bad choices. Others were guards watching over the other Lorcans as Lorcan. The true Lorcan tried to understand what he was seeing. Was the voice being controlled by something, trying to make him lose his sanity? So he spent the rest of his life, however short it would end up being, running through the darkness, never to find his way out? Insanity is an interesting theory, but no, my task is not to break you in that way. You are to know the truth, the whole truth, and make a decision as you are the next to walk these paths. The next to find their way into the abyss. Do you remember why you created it? Do you understand who you are? Lorcan shook his head. It was obvious he didn't understand who he was, but he knew where to find the answers. If the voice was right, and maybe the voice was right. He breathed in deeply, trying to find his center. Another of the things his grandfather taught him when he was younger. Controlling his more negative emotions was important. Only then had he lost his center with his grandfather. Finding it once more was the beginning. Going back to that lesson, Lorcan found himself looking at himself. His grandfather was with him too. A hard thing to ignore, but he managed it, as he heard the right choice in his mind, rather than his own. Although, if he was honest with himself, his grandfather almost sounded like he would if he was many years older. Connecting with the control he'd lost, Lorcan opened his eyes, and it was as though he was able to see the truth for the first time in his life. He was in the middle of what looked to be some kind of nebula, alone like he'd always been. Something slowly becoming more painful as the years passed by. Years, decades, centuries, millennia. Everything was the same way as it had always been. Earth almost called to him, looking as it always had, beautiful, lush, home to animals and nothing more. Going down to it, Lorcan walked through the trees, breathing the air, and thought about what to do next. How was he going to change things for the better? Was it even possible? The animals didn't seem to fear him. One, a wolf, moved closer. It didn't have a name then, but Lorcan knew as it had become a dog, the kind of pet he had once had when he was younger, until the time came when it left him too. The pain probably ended up breaking him. Death was complicated in so many ways. Petting the wolf, Lorcan thought of what his future was going to hold. Nothing in the universe. He was alone, and he would always be alone unless he did something to change the future. It wasn't as though he couldn't leave the wolf with one scratch behind the ears. He delved deeper into the earth, going through the layers. Deep enough it was likely never to be found. Lorcan started work. If it was, it needed to be a safe place for those who learned the whole truth about who he was. Somewhere he could make the choice once more. If it was right to keep up with things as they were, maybe the time would come when he'd bring an end to it all, but there was no way to know if it would happen, or when it would be, or who might make the choice in the end. Little by little he created the ruin, the abyss, a hiding place for the truth. It wouldn't be easy to find, but those who did would learn everything. From the beginning to that moment as they stood within the darkness, making a decision that might change everything. The very way he'd made a decision he knew would change everything for the best. Moving from the ruin to the surface once more, Lorcan started work on the next stage. Beings made from his consciousness. Slowly dwindling himself down to nothing. And yet he was everything. He was everyone. Man, woman, child. Not the animals. They were something else entirely. But it didn't matter, because finally he felt like he'd made the right choice. As he had that thought, he let himself forget. Lorcan no longer knew who he was. He was simply another human. And from there came the billions who inhabited Earth. All of them part of the beginning. Unlike anyone else, he knew the whole truth about the world. Others had made the same journey, learned the same truth, none of them making the decision to return. The darkness was no longer impenetrable. Able to see the ruin, which was better called a maze, somewhere his selves would wander until they touched the truth. The suit become part of them in a way that hadn't been before. Breathing in deep, Lorcan sat down on the stone. He left the ruin, everything would fade away. Like before, he'd been alone. But the worst part was that he had known he was alone. Maybe he remembered all the lives he'd lived, able to dwell in those memories. Only it would never be the same as it was. Yet humans had done so much bad. The choice he'd made changed Earth in multiple ways. Most of them terrible. And Lorcan knew if he headed back through the maze, gaining all of those people as part of him once more, everything would be different. Earth would return to how it was before. A paradise. He was truly willing to be selfish enough to let himself destroy a planet. Biting down on his lip, feeling the pain, he thought of all the lives he'd lived, where he'd hurt in one way or another. Traumatized by those around him because they were traumatized themselves. It went down from one generation to the next. Lorcan's own life, a reminder of that. Something that broke him. Others were broken in a similar way. Hence prison, being sent down to the sarcophagus knowing he was likely to die. But death wasn't the worst possibility. And he'd never known, never had a way to. The truth hidden in the very deepest depths of the earth. Something people were going to keep exploring. Another thing he could keep from happening. if he made the decision to walk back. All it took was him walking back through the maze to find there was no one there. No one anywhere. Alone, he closed his eyes. Lorcan thought of the good in the world. It existed. Everywhere. He might not have been able to see it. His own path that much stronger. But he was able to see it as he sat in the maze, the ruin, the abyss, the sarcophagus. And more than anything else, the truth. How did the others decide? Exactly the way you are. Those who come down here have found life to be the most complicated it could be. It's part of the reason. You're the ones who need to make the choice. You're the ones who truly understand pain in a way that those who are happy cannot. They aren't able to understand how bad things are at times. Yet, as you have thought, there is also good. Pain was something Lorcan felt before, as he wandered the universe searching for someone to be with, not to be alone any longer. Millennia of hunting for that one thing, and in the end he found it. But it wasn't what he expected it to be. Instead, it was a world he was able to claim for his own, to build something which wasn't perfect. Nothing could be perfect. He was fallible, so his creation was fallible. They make mistakes. Lorcan made mistakes, letting the pain get the better of him, and he wasn't the only one who did. Had it not been for the others, those who made bright choices, he might have made the decision to walk back through the maze, to where she was waiting. Only she wouldn't be there any longer. She'd be one of the first to become part of him again, along with the guards and anyone else in the facility. From there, it would be the rest of humanity. Little by little, until he was the only one left. He wouldn't be Lorcan anymore. Instead, he'd be the Wanderer once more. With nothing, Earth would be able to return to how it was. And maybe it was the choice he should make for the planet. But he couldn't. Leaving would destroy him, able to see it in a way he couldn't before. He saw how loneliness was slowly transforming him, and that was part of the reason. There was both dark and light within the human race. How he might have become dark enough to destroy the entire universe because it hadn't given him what he wanted. A companion, someone to love, the way he'd come to love in so many different ways. Maybe he would destroy Earth by staying, but surely it was better to sacrifice one planet than it was to sacrifice them all. Lorcan's decision was made. He stayed, sat in the ruins, the same way all the others had done before him, hundreds of them making similar choice. They chose the universe over Earth. They chose their own sanity over anything else. Yes, a selfish choice, and yet it was a logical one. The most logical one for everything. He thought back to the wolf, scratching ears, one animal giving him a moment of something he could never have imagined before. It was then he knew what he needed, in a way he hadn't before, so he took it. One day he might not need it. But that day hadn't yet come. So quoth this raven, "My darlings, I think there's probably only going to be 2 videos up this week, and the other one being hopefully the end of the time machine. Big thanks to Scare in a Box for this wonderful story to share, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Have a beautiful, lovely day. Bye-bye. What? You're still here after the whole story? I really appreciate that, darlings. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't. And I always love to hear from you. Have a glorious day, my darlings.